As the facts have emerged in the case of Air India 171, that plane that crashed while taking off from Ahmedabad, India on June 12th, it's become more and more clear that what we're talking about is in all likelihood a case of mass murder-suicide on the part of the captain. Now, mass murder-suicide by pilots is a rare phenomenon. It's not unknown. A lot of people think that MH370 is such a case. I personally don't. But there have been a handful of cases where the evidence is pretty clear that that's what happened. And as rare as those cases are, they share some commonalities. And today I'm going to talk about that with researcher Alpo Vuorio of the University of Helsinki, who has published a paper on that topic. And he's got some really interesting things to say. What's particularly noteworthy about Air India 171 is that in one important way, it doesn't match any of the other cases that we have seen historically. And I'm going to make the case that if the cause is what it seems to be, namely suicide, then the perpetrator came up with an important innovation, let's say. Not a good innovation, but an important one. And I actually worry that this could pose a danger to the traveling public. I'm going to talk about all that right now. Hi, everybody. Jeff Wise back with you for an episode of Finding MH370, where we're not going to talk so much about the missing Malaysian airliner, although I still think it deserves to fall under the same rubric because pilot suicide, or at least the possibility of pilot suicide, is something that we really have to carefully consider in thinking about the case. And the more thoroughly we can understand that phenomenon, the sharper the lens we can bring to the case. Okay, so why might we suspect that Air India 171 could be suicide? Let's real quickly review the final moments of the flight and see if we can find an answer to that. So this is a Boeing 787. It began its takeoff roll at 1:37 p.m. The first officer, 32-year-old Cliver Kunder, he's sitting in the right-hand seat. He has his hands on the flight controls. He is actually physically flying the plane. On his left is the captain, 56-year-old Sumit Sabharwal. Assuming they were following normal procedures, Sabharwal would have had his right hand on the throttle levers, ready to pull back if something went wrong as they were on the takeoff roll. For instance, if they blew a tire or if something went wrong with the engines, he would be ready to pull back the power, throw on the brakes, abort the takeoff if something was wrong. That way they would have time to bring the plane to a stop and they could take the plane in to get service or whatever needed to be done. That didn't happen. The initial part of the takeoff roll went smoothly, and at 1:38:33, the aircraft reached 176 miles per hour, and this was a point called V1. V1 is the last opportunity that the flight crew would have had to bring the plane safely to a stop. Once you are past V1, you've used up too much runway, you are moving too quickly, you are no longer able to bring the plane safely to a stop. If you try to do that, you will crash at the end of the runway. So your best bet, no matter what happens, your best bet is to keep flying, to take off and try to deal with whatever the problem is in the air. So V1 is a very important decision point when you're taking off. So the plane reaches V1 at 1:38:33. 2 seconds later, the plane reaches its takeoff speed of 176 miles per hour. 4 seconds after that, it lifts off the runway. The wheels come up off the ground. So this is all happening in a very tight time frame. 3 seconds later, 3 seconds after liftoff, someone flips the fuel cutoff switch for one of the engines, then 1 second later, they flip the switch for the other one. Okay, now both engines they begin to lose thrust as the fuel is no longer flowing into their combustion chambers. At this point, the first officer asked the captain, this is on the transcript that was released as part of the the Indian crash investigation. The first officer asked the captain why he had cut off the fuel. The captain denied having done that. 10 seconds later, someone moved the fuel switches back to the run position. When we have to assume it was the first officer. So the fuel is now flowing back into the engines reignite. One of them has enough time to begin generating increasing thrust, but it wasn't enough to stop the descent of the plane. And 5 seconds after 1:39 p.m., which is just 30 seconds after liftoff, one of the pilots called Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. 2 seconds later, the black boxes stopped recording as the plane crashed into buildings in a fireball. So all of this is happening in a very, very short amount of time. And this report declined to speculate as to whether the fuel switches could have been flipped accidentally. Many pilots that you've seen on YouTube or I've talked to, it would not have been possible for this to have happened accidentally. For one thing, after reaching V1, neither pilot is supposed to have a hand on the throttle. So an unexpected jolt or something could not have caused their hand to accidentally hit the switches and flip them the other way. Also, the switches are designed in such a way that you can't just hit them and move them. They have to be pulled out and then moved. And an accidental lateral shove is just not enough to cause it to move. And also, thirdly, the switches are protected. They've got a triangular metal guard that will prevent them from being accidentally hit. So lots of reasons to think that this was not an accidental movement. The timing is also just incredibly suspicious. This shutoff, it happened just seconds after reaching V1, that point at which it is impossible to recover and bring the plane to a stop on the ground. And the fact that the fuel shutoff switches were moved 1 second apart, boom, boom, that also indicates that it couldn't have just been, getting bumped, which would have, if somehow that had been possible, they would have both switched off at the same time. So if you take all of these facts together, quite a few aviation experts have concluded that one of the pilots must have shut off the engines intentionally. And through some other evidence that the crash investigators came up with, it's generally considered that this would be the captain, the older of the two, namely Sumit Soberwal. One person who's been outspoken about this is Steve Scheibner, he's an airline pilot who runs a popular YouTube channel under the handle of Captain Steve.
There was a dual engine loss. It was due to the fuel control switches being placed to cut off. Now, the next question is going to be, could that have been a mistake? Could that have been done inadvertently? No, the answer is absolutely not.
Okay, so to reach the conclusion that the crash was deliberately caused by one of the pilots, that's kind of a barn burner in itself. This was not a mechanical failure. This was not a human error, which together, caused the lion's share of crashes. This was someone deliberately deciding to kill himself and the passengers and the crew, and that is just stunning. It's depressing. It's hard to get your mind around, frankly. But there's something else. There's another dimension to this, another level of incredible, if you will, and that is the way that the act was carried out. It is unprecedented. Why? Because every other known case of pilot suicide, the pilot who did it initiated the act at altitude. So the plane is up there, 30,000 feet, what have you, and then the plane is made to plunge into the ground, or they set the autopilot to crash the plane. It's a long process, and it takes a certain amount of time to lose all that altitude. It's fraught. It's dangerous because you have to deal with other people on the plane. So in numerous cases, you have the perpetrator, either waiting until the other pilot has left to go to the bathroom or something and then locking the door, or in one case, wrestling with the controls as the other pilot tries to prevent them from doing it. So it's a lot to go through. And I would say it must be pretty demotivating if you wanted to do something like this for God knows what reason. It would be demotivating to contemplate that kind of struggle that you would have to go through. So what Soberwall did was much quicker and, efficient, if you want to look at it that way. There was no fighting. There was no fussing. There was no prolonged descent into oblivion. He waits until the plane has passed V1. He waits a few seconds more until the wheels have lifted off the ground, and flip. He has doomed himself and everyone aboard the plane, and there's nothing anyone can do about it. They're too low, they're too slow, they're too heavy. It takes too long for the engines to spool up. They are all dead men walking. The mission has been accomplished with the slightest flick of two switches, and it's all over very quick after that. That to me is chilling to the bone. But it's also a kind of, I hate to say it, but it's a kind of genius. Because Soberwall has invented a better way to commit mass murder-suicide. In a 2023 paper in the journal Safety, Alpo Vuorio and his colleagues in Finland and the UK, they looked at 4 plane crashes in which there was substantial evidence that the crash had been caused deliberately by one of the pilots. They wanted to try to understand what the psychological commonalities might be. Their goal was to change procedures so that this kind of thing could be prevented in the future. And I really thought that Alpo would be the perfect person to talk to try to understand the mindset behind the kind of murderous self-destruction that we see in Air India 171 that many people think is at play at MH370. And I was delighted that he was kind enough to talk to me about his work. So I have with me today Alpo Vuorio from Finland. And Alpo, you did a really interesting paper with some colleagues where maybe you could tell me, you were looking at suspected cases of pilot suicide.
It was about I would like to say, cases which are reflective quite well this unfortunate phenomenon and the accident reports. And we wanted to see what is I would like to say, how well they were able to define that the cause for these accidents were really this pilot-assisted aircraft suicide. So that was the starting point for us, yes.
Well, obviously, I mean, there haven't been that many cases. You looked at 4. And why did you look at those 4 cases in particular?
Oh, they had quite a good, I would like to say in a general level, good accident reports. They were well representative of this phenomenon, and they were major accidents.
Okay. And maybe you could just run down what the 4 cases were that you focused on.
If we look at the timeline, was Silk Air Flight MI185. This accident was in 1997, and this flight was traveling from Jakarta, Soekarno Hatta International Airport, to Singapore, Changi Airport, and the airline plane descended from its cruising altitude of 23,000 feet and impacted the ground. And that was the first case.
I think it actually hit a river.
Yeah.
It flew into a river and it was embedded deeply. I think it was believed it might have even gone supersonic. It was such a steep dive.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
The second case was a little bit later in 1999. It was Egyptair Flight 991 crashed into the Atlantic Ocean south of Massachusetts. and it happened about 29 minutes after takeoff. And that was again a case which was suspected to be like this aircraft assisted suicide.
Right.
And the third, it was just about a year before Germanwings. It was a Mozambique Airlines accident, which was very, very like, and it happened when the first officer stated that he had to go to the toilet and then close the setup for how it happened was very, very similar if you look afterwards what happened in Germanwings. And the fourth case was this 2015 Germanwings case. So these four cases we analyzed.
It seems to me that there's an interesting kind of similarity between all of them. Namely, in that in each of these cases, they were at cruise altitude. And am I right in thinking that in each case, the suspected perpetrator waited until the other pilot had left and then put it into a dive, or commanded the autopilot to take it into the ground?
Yes, there are some similarities in that sense. From my point of view, I'm thinking more of human mind. Was it the same kind of thinking in these accidents
Okay.
as pilots? But if you think that way, then maybe you can find those similarities. Yes, that's great.
The reason I bring it up is because there's a very interesting contrast with Air India, which, as you know, is widely being considered as a potential suicide case. And that case is very different in that the action takes place not at cruise altitude, but immediately after takeoff. And it seems that it's novel in that sense.
I think that accident is so recent that we need to be a little bit careful before judging it as a suicide. But from the accident point of view, we really want to know what has happened. And
Right.
from the technical point of view, the preliminary report didn't have any suggestions. So there is still a lot of work to do.
There's an idea that you talk about in your paper of a forensic autopsy. This is the idea of going back and trying to assess the psychological condition of the pilot before the crash. Is that right?
Yes, it is a very laborious, because sometimes we think that it's enough if we know what the pilot has done, let me say, within 1 week before the accident. But the reality, when we start to look these tricky things, is that we need to go to the whole life of the pilot. So it's a laborious. And then there are also, in many countries, there are restrictions how to get that information. And then
Restrictions on the medical information, the medical records.
yeah, here, let me say, in Europe, we don't have a harmonized situation, so that usually where I work, we get this information. But I know countries that accident investigators has really big difficulties from to get the information, because laws are so a little bit different in each country.
You write in the paper that some of the cases have a fair bit of information. I believe in the case of Germanwings, there was he had quite an extensive psychiatric history. In others, there's very little known. Sometimes the investigating authorities don't seem particularly amenable to that kind of diagnosis. They might find it, shameful for their country's image if that plane was ascribed to suicide. I wanted to ask you, though, given the limitations that you describe, are there psychological similarities, or would there be sort of commonalities that you would point to in terms of the psychological state of the pilots who commit suicide?
There must be something which is related to mental health, sometimes to substance use, sometimes to family things, and etc. So sometimes economical things. So all these, or together or separately, may have a pressure. And if it happens, the worst scenario, then I think we miss one thing. Pilots do suicides, and they don't fly, so they die as people usually in suicides. But this
You're
time,
saying that pilots commit suicide just the way everyone commits suicide. They might take poison, or they might hang themselves, or jump out of a
yeah,
bridge.
that is
They don't
how.
have to do it. If they want to commit, if they want to end their life, they can do so without
Yeah, they can,
killing hundreds of other
that
people.
happens. That happens, and we are not talking about them very much. But even I know some cases. There are issues around them. But then we talk about this very special and unfortunate case that we call it homicide or murder suicide. But you are not only killing yourself, but you are understanding. In some cases, if you are really having a serious mental disease, that you are psychotic, maybe it's hard to say how much you understand what you are doing, but you are anyhow carrying some other people, a lot of them, with you. And that is a very big difference between the so-called traditional suicide and this one.
I mean, this kind of raises a question for me of what counts as an explanation. We could say, well, he had monetary problems, he had relationship problems, he had psychosis, he had maybe even a interaction of medicines that he was taking. But are these things really explanations? Because, as you point out, people commit suicide without killing all their passengers and crew members that have these factors at play in their life, and people don't even commit suicide at all if they have these factors in their life. I guess what I'm saying is the undertaking of trying to explain human behavior is maybe a fool's errand.
Uh, it's from the research point of view, if you have a very rare phenomenon, it's really hard to find those common laws, how it happens. So there are some common features, but it's quite a heterogeneous phenomenon, and what is making it challenging and really difficult to prevent also.
So what can we do? I mean, I was making the point to someone recently where I was saying that, in the wake of Air India, that while these murder suicides that we're talking about are very, very rare, traditional accidents, mechanical accidents, human factors accidents, they're also becoming very, very rare. And so it might even be that murder suicides as a percentage of all commercial aviation fatalities is increasing. I don't know if you would agree with that premise, but I guess my main question is, what is there anything that we can really do?
So we need to give a very easy access to these services and not stigmatize these people. So we don't know each time what is it leading. So the message is that take seriously when you find mental issues. It's not only that it may lead to this, it may also cause many other harms. So that is I would like to say my thinking at the moment.
No, I think that seems to be a message that is resonating in other ways here in the United States. Well, actually, it's available around the world. There was a TV show called The Rehearsal, where the show really focused on pilot mental health as an important concern. And that was a popular entertainment. So I think the message is people are amenable to that message.
After the German wings, that there was a suggestion that worldwide there needs to be some right for the health personnel have this duty of notification. So that person, if they find out that there is a pilot in trouble, so it's they have a double responsibility: the responsibility of the patient, but also responsibility of the society. In this case, of those passengers there. But in some countries, it's very hard to put this truth, because you may be in trouble if you do this notification.
Now, one of the cases you looked at as a kind of adjunct outside of the main four that you looked at was MH370. Now, this is an MH370 podcast primarily, so I definitely had to ask you your thoughts on that. A lot of basically the reason that the pilot was suspected was because there simply was no other plausible explanation that the authorities could imagine. And so they thought, by sort of a process of elimination, it had to be the captain. In looking at his background, they weren't able to find any, as I'm aware, psychological red flags. Of course, that raises the question of whether the investigation was complete enough. I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think it's a case unsolved so far, and the problem is that we are having not enough, or we are having a little bit like only limited data about what really, I mean, physically happened. And
Right.
that is the we don't have these flight data records. We are having a very limited data. The other thing which is would be important to look very carefully at this history of both pilots, actually, as it's in these cases. And it is hard to say how it was done. You have a very little information that is very shortly written in that report, so it's hard to decide how deeply the investigators did the work.
You know, it's important to try to sort out the difference between there not being enough information and there being a fair bit of information, but the information does not match what we would expect. You're quite right in pointing out that the Malaysian police investigation was not very thoroughly reported in that document that was released. But there have been numerous investigations, informal investigations by journalists to talk to his family members, to talk to colleagues and everything. And as far as that goes, again, it seems to be an evidence of an absence of evidence, I would say, in that he seems to have been really well liked. He was a senior captain in the organization. He was a trusted and respected colleague. His family says that he was emotionally stable. He seems to have been financially stable.
It is quite a challenge to get a reliable picture of the person afterwards. So when we go to the peers, friends, relatives, loved ones, and ask about the pilot, it needs to be done very early phases, even it's painful. Because afterwards, they get a lot of information from TV, radio, etc. And it's possible that the picture, what they want to first maybe tell, is really changing. So it doesn't prove necessarily if there is not records that it has not been. So that is making it even more difficult.
That's true. You're quite right. I mean, I did want to just point out that I did a Kindle single on both MH370 and Germanwings 9525. So I spent a fair bit of time looking at both of them. It is striking that in the case of Andreas Lubitz, the first officer of Germanwings 9525, he had an extensive, well-documented history of mental health issues. And in fact, he was, I think, facing the possibility of losing his license and losing his career as a result. But as you say, I mean, different culture, different circumstances, the fact that there was masses of evidence in one case and none in the other might not be due to the fact that there was no mental illness at play. Maybe it was just not documented. But I did want to go on to ask you a little bit more about Air India. As you say, it's very early. We don't have a ton of information. It does seem that the captain turned off the fuel. The end came very quickly. It was a matter of seconds before these men both lost their life. But as you say, it sounds like you're not quite ready to ascribe this to necessarily suicide right now? Do you think there's other possible explanations?
Yeah, I think from the accident investigation perspective, the thing is to understand why this happened. And we are not, as an accident investigator, wanting to, and our idea is not to blame anybody. We want to prevent that this type of accident will ever happen again. So that is point. I have a little bit learned from the papers that, that it seems that they are now going through the medical and psychological history. I would like to say it's important for both pilots and to see if there is anything which is important. I'm a big question mark at the moment because there was nothing which is touching personally me, which is about medical side of the thing. So I wish that this will be discovered properly.
Now, as you say, the objective of an accident report, an accident investigation, is not to lay blame, but to understand what happened so that recommendations can be written and hopefully prevent it in the future. If the case is that it was murder, suicide, then we are dealing with the question of how do you disincentivize or prevent this kind of action from being taken, perhaps with, as you say, improved mental health services so that people don't reach that kind of breaking point. That's what I hope happens. I hope this never occurs again. However, I do think it's worth acknowledging that there is a kind of darker possibility, which is that sometimes things like this can inspire copycats. And I wanted to add you the four cases that you cover in your paper are all very similar. And in fact, in the case of Andreas Lubitz, his tablet computer was found to have searches for MH370 at a time when it was widely believed that MH370 was a case of murder-suicide. So I think it's really worth wondering if if Air India is a suicide, it might inspire other similar kinds of acts. Is that a danger?
We have been interested about this copycat phenomenon, which is a little bit like not so well defined, but everybody understands that it's like copying some method how to do the things. If we go to India case, I'm not aware about this type of way, and then it's maybe very difficult to say that if the case is so that it could be any copycat. There must be some evidence about that. But it was touching me very much because we published our first paper about this murder-suicide in 2014, just a few months before the German wings, and we mentioned this case in Zimbabwe and the method, how it was done. But the thing was that because it happened in Africa, it didn't arise so much media.
It also involved one of the pilots waiting for the other to go to the bathroom and then setting the autopilot to descend into the ground.
But Zimbabwe happened 2014. It was in our paper which we published. It was only based on how it happened, the newspaper thing. But the method about that was very, very similar. That the door was closed, and then the other pilot was away from the and then it happened. So that was late or sometimes in 2014, and the German wings was 2015. But it was not so much notified. So we need to be very careful when we find out this. But every of these accidents may give us something to learn.
Do you think that they are becoming more common?
It's hard to say. If we think the mental health in general, we need to be very careful that we take care about it, because it's always possible that certain very, very tiny percent of people who have these mental health problems end up to this very serious type of suicide type. But because there is still, if you want to have human mental health, there is usually some mental health issues still behind, sometimes several. So that is best, I think, that we can do.
The kind of fatal crashes like this that get so much attention are so very rare that it becomes very difficult to try to solve them in an absolute sense, because we're really dealing with the really tough kind of fringe cases, by definition. So whether we will see more progress in the decade ahead, I think it's very much an open question.
It is, but remembering that these cases, even they are rare, the impact is always very severe. So that is in our risk estimation raising the red flag that we need to be careful with this. So it's very easy to understand if something happens very often, we need to be careful. But even this is very rare, we need to try to learn about this. And I think based on our paper, we can improve this accident and we can create, because starting point for the very good accident investigation, which is really trying to do this psychological autopsy, was a German thing report. It was I dare to say first time in this history that we really had a so detailed prescription what has happened, and that has learned us quite a lot.
Alpo, that's very fascinating to hear your perspective on this. I'm really grateful to you for taking the time to talk to me today. I'm going to put a link to your paper in the show notes for this episode so people can check it out for themselves. And I'll be very curious to follow your work as you go forward.
Thank you very much for this interview. It has been a pleasure to talk with you.
All right. Thank you. I want to thank Alpo again for taking the time to talk to me. Obviously, he's more cautious than me in ascribing the crash of Air India 171 to pilot suicide. I think that's his professionalism speaking. In due time, hopefully the Indian authorities will complete their investigation and the explanation will be clear and universally agreed on. And it's good form to wait until then before, flatly stating one's conclusions. That's all well and good. But until then, I don't think it's too early to start processing the possible implications of another mass murder suicide in an airplane, and thinking about what we can do about it. Based on what has happened in the past, anyone who's thinking about carrying out an act like this is going to study the crashes of the past and what you could call the disturbing brilliance of the Air India 171 method is going to stand out very clearly to someone who's going to contemplate an act like this in the future. What I'm trying to say is that I am afraid that other people, sooner or later, might try to emulate what was done for the first time on June 12th. And there will be even less chance that anyone will be able to stop them. That is a dark note to end on, but I am afraid that that's the sobering reality that we live in. And if things are taking a dark turn, that's better to at least, acknowledge it. Maybe we can do something. As Alpo suggests, one thing we could do is to really focus on pilot mental health. Try to prevent people from reaching that kind of breakdown. And if we can, at least we can say we tried our hardest. Well, that's it for now. This is Jeff Wise. If you have any questions or comments, write them here or on the show page at findingmh370.com. Thanks. I'll see you next time.